In this video, we're going to develop the rules for adding and subtracting integers using common sense. So let's add 5 plus 2. Notice that is a positive 5, so again we're going to start at 0 and we're going to go 5 units to the right. Then we have a plus 2, so we're going to go 2 more units to the right. So notice where we wind up at 7, a positive 7. Now let's do negative 5 minus 2. You could write that as negative 5 plus a minus 2. Again, we're going to start at 0 and we're going to go backwards 5 units and then backwards 2 more units. Notice where we wind up at negative 7. Now notice the signs of these two examples. The first one has 2 pluses. The second one has 2 minuses. Notice they both wind up with the answer of 7. One's a positive 7 and one's a negative 7. So if you have a 5 and a 2, what would you do with those two numbers to get a 7? You would add them, of course. So whenever your signs are the same, you are going to add your two numbers together to get the answer. Now what about the sign? Well, notice the sign of the first two. The first one, it's a plus 5 and a plus 2. Therefore, my answer was positive. The second one, both of them were negative. Therefore, my answer was negative, which makes sense because if you start at 0 and you go in the positive direction for 5 and then keep going in the positive direction, of course you're going to wind up in the positive direction. If you start at 0 and go in the negative direction and keep going in the negative direction, of course you're going to wind up in the negative direction. So, the first rule. If the numbers have the same sign, you're going to add them together. And then you're going to keep the sign. Now notice that we added in this problem even though there were 2 minuses. So I have to inform you, and it's very sad, but I have to inform you that your kindergarten teacher lied to you. In kindergarten, you were taught that plus meant add and minus meant subtract. But that's not the case. It just tells you the direction. Plus is in the positive direction and minus is in the negative direction. That's why we need rules, because plus doesn't always mean add and minus doesn't always mean subtract. But we do know when to add, right? We add when the numbers have the same sign. Let's talk about different signs. 5 minus 2. You could write that as a positive 5 plus a minus 2. So on our number line, again, we're going to start at 0. We're going to go 5 units in the positive direction. But because the 2 is a negative, we're going to back up 2 places. So we're going to wind up at 3. Now, with negative 5 plus 2, it's very similar, except we're going to start by backing up. We back up 5 units, and then we're going to go forward 2 units. We're going to wind up then at negative 3. Notice we have, in both of these, we have a 5 and a 2, but this time we wind up with 3. What do we do with a 5 and a 2 to get a 3? We subtract. So when our signs are different, this one's a plus, that one's a minus, that's a plus, we're going to subtract to get our answer. Now, what about the sign? How do you determine if it is a positive answer or a negative answer? We'll look at the very first one that we did with the different signs. When it was a positive 5, notice that the 5 is the longest length. So we're going to go 5 in the positive direction and just a little bit in the negative direction. So we wind up in the positive direction. But on the second one, the 5 was in the negative direction. So we went the furthest distance negative, and then we just come a little bit back positive. So we're going to wind up with a negative answer. 5 is our largest number. So that means you're going to subtract your numbers and keep the sign of the biggest. So let's come back down to our rules. If the numbers have different signs, then you're going to subtract the numbers and keep the sign of the big one. Now, a lot of students get confused. Do I keep the sign or do I keep the sign of the big one? Well, the sign of the first ones is the same as the sign of the big one. So just always remember to keep the sign of the big one. So the rules for adding and subtracting: if the signs are the same, you add them. If the signs are different, you subtract them, but you always keep the sign of the biggest number.